putting public safety at risk. Thank you.
Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak in support of the Fair Work Amendment Respect for Emergency Services Volunteers Bill 2016. And I'd like to take the opportunity to place on the record my thanks and appreciation for the outstanding job that the Minister, Senator Cash, and the Prime Minister have done on this issue. They listened to the community concern about this agreement. They are acting swiftly to address it in this bill, and Victorians, CFA volunteers and anyone who lives in an area protected by them will be grateful for their efforts in this area. I'm very proud to be the first Coalition Speaker to speak on this bill. Proud as a Victorian senator, because nothing could be more fundamental to my duty to protect the interest of Victorians than to stand up for an organisation and for people in CFA volunteers who do so much to protect us. Proud to speak as a Liberal, because I think this issue very powerfully highlights the deep philosophical difference between this side of the chamber and the other when it comes to the question of civil society and how we best protect ourselves from the ills that we have in our society and the dangers that we face. Should communities self-organise, volunteer, contribute their own time to the best interest of their community, or should it always be directed and paid for and controlled by a government? We on this side of the chamber believe that it's a wonderful thing that communities and individuals are willing to give up their time and their effort to protect their community. We don't think it's a bad thing at all. But it seems that the worldview of those opposite is that if this job could be done by someone who could be paid, if this job could be done by someone who could be employed by the government, well, then we'd much prefer to have that than have someone who's a volunteer take up that role. It was an honour to participate in the parliamentary inquiry into this bill with my colleagues Senator Hume and particularly ably chaired by my colleague Senator Bridget McKenzie, who did a wonderful job in this inquiry, and it really brought to the fore the key issues that we're facing in this debate with this EBA, with this bill and with the CFA. I grew up in Upper Ferntree Gully, in the outer eastern suburbs of Victoria, and it's a beautiful part of the world in the Dandenongs, but it is a fire-prone part of the world. And everybody who lives in Upper Ferntree Gully knows, after the Ash Wednesday fires of 1983, how important the CFA is to protecting their homes, their livelihoods, their businesses and their lives. Tragically, on that day, many lives were lost, many homes were lost, many lives were ruined, but our CFA volunteers and those brigades did a particularly wonderful job in protecting them and fighting them and doing their best to come up against the awesome force of those fires on that day. But it's not all that they did. I remember as a young boy living in Grandview Crescent in Upper Ferntree Gully that on Christmas Eve the CFA brigades would come with the fire truck and dress up as Santa Claus and come and visit the children in our street and other streets in Upper Ferntree Gully. And that's a very nice demonstration of how they see their role as going far beyond just protecting us from fire, but being deeply involved in their community and providing for their community. And I have a very positive impression of the work that they did from that experience. Of course, it's not unique to that part of Victoria or even just to Victoria. This is an issue which we all face and which was most powerfully demonstrated in recent times on Black Saturday in February 2009. No Victorian or Australian could be unaware of the heroic efforts by the CFA, including both, I should add, paid and volunteer staff on those days. The question I want to ask today is, how is it that we got here? How did we get to such an acrimonious ending to an EBA? All public sector EBAs have the capacity to be fraught, to be controversial. They have competing interests between taxpayers on the one hand and the paid employees on the other, between the government's interest in achieving a policy objectives and others. All of them have capacity to be fraught, but none have been so quite fraught as this EBA, as this negotiation. It has been an extraordinary divisive debate, and it has left an absolute trail of destruction, a trail of destruction through the CFA, a trail of destruction through the Andrews Labor government. How many other EBAs have cost the jobs of the CEO of the organisation, in this case of the CFA, the Chief Fire Officer of the CFA, the entire board of the CFA, and a Labor minister who, in my view, was doing an admirable job in trying to defend the interest of an organisation and of the volunteers who she was responsible for. And let me place on the record my admiration for Jane Garrett and her courage. It is not an easy thing for any of us in public life to take a stand on an issue like this, to be willing to resign, to lose a glittering ministerial career over a point of principle. But I have to say it's particularly difficult in the modern Labor Party. Jane Garrett has been subject to ferocious bullying and intimidation because of the stand she took. We have heard evidence in the media and through the Senate inquiry of times at which she was warned that there would be an axe put through her head if she did not reverse course and support this EBA and support the United Firefighters Union. The threats and intimidation haven't ended there. They have of course, affected the lives of our volunteers and have probably contributed to damaging the relationships between our volunteers and paid firefighters, and that is incredibly concerning for Victorians as we head into summer and as we head into the fire season. The UFU tells us that this dispute is a furphy, that there is no interest in the federal government in intervening in this dispute, that there is nothing for Victorians to be concerned about, because they assure us that this EBA deals only with the pay and the conditions of the paid employees of the CFA. It affects volunteers in no way, according to the UFU. If that was the case, I cannot understand why so many volunteers and the Volunteer Fire Brigades Victoria would take such a strong interest and have such great concerns about this EBA. It doesn't matter to them how much their colleagues who are paid receive. It doesn't matter to them the conditions under which they're employed, unless, of course, it directly affects their interest, as it so clearly does in this case. I'm going to go through some of the clauses and mention some of the clauses that have been drawn to our attention that demonstrate that it does. But there's a more fundamental point than this. At its heart, the CFA is a volunteer organisation. It has 60,000 volunteers. It also has paid firefighters, and they do a good job, and they are entitled to have good working conditions and to be well paid for it. But they only number in the several hundred. There are 60,000 volunteers. At its heart, the CFA is a volunteer organisation, and that means that any EBA which impacts on the CFA's ability to manage itself, to manage its own operations, inextricably is linked to the interests of volunteers and directly affects their interests. It's not possible for an EBA so restrictive on the decision-making processes of management and so deferential to the UFU to not affect the volunteers. That's, of course, assuming that it is, as the UFU says it is, that it only relates to the pay and conditions of paid staff. But I think, and I'm just going to highlight some of the clauses in the UFU agreement that really contradict this. I won't read them all. There are 46 very ably put together by the VFBV, and I acknowledge in the presence in the gallery today of the VFB team so capably led by Andrew Ford, and thank you for everything you've done in this debate and for your community. Just give a couple of examples. Clause 16.1. This is, contrary to the UFU, directly about the interest of volunteers. It relates to the Volunteer Support Program and Volunteer Support Officers, and I'll quote directly from the EBA. It states that the CFA will consult and reach agreement with the UFU on the structure of any volunteer support programs. That doesn't sound like something which relates to the pay and conditions of a paid employee or a UFU member, but there are others. I'll go on. Peer support programs. Clause 60.11. Peer support employees under this agreement will be drawn from professional firefighters, obviously excluding volunteers. Clause 83.4. Uniforms, appliances and equipments. The CFA and UFU must agree on all aspects of the articles of clothing, equipment including personal and protective equipment, technology, stationwear and appliances. Of course, these apply not just to paid employees of the CFA but also volunteers. This agreement directly affects the interests of volunteers, directly affects the interests of anyone involved in the CFA. And The way in which we can identify why this agreement is so different and why it is so far-reaching is that this is the first EBA of the CFA which has been so contentious. We heard evidence in the inquiry from former board members of the CFA who were involved in previous EBA negotiations, and they said that there were issues and they had concerns, but ultimately they felt that they were able to agree to those EBAs because it didn't detrimentally affect the interests of the CFA or its volunteer firefighters. This one does. This one has had a totally different response because it is a totally different agreement. Why is it that this agreement has been so fractious and so contentious? In part, it's because the UFU and the Victorian government have been so unwilling to make any concessions, to listen to any of the concerns of the volunteers and others who have concerns about this agreement. We heard evidence from the new CEO during the inquiry, Ms Frances Diver, who told us about her process in coming to the decision that the CFA should recommend that the EBA be agreed to. She said that over a 6 to 8 week period after she was appointed CEO, she engaged in further discussions with the UFU, and a sum total of 2 concessions were a result of those negotiations, 2 material changes to the EBA. In my view, they don't amount to material changes, though Ms Diver disagreed and said that they were. But in an agreement with hundreds and hundreds of clauses, many of which are extremely restrictive, to get only 2 concessions is very minor, and particularly over such a short period of time. But the main thing that Ms Diver said that allowed her to give confidence that the CFA should agree to this agreement was that the UFU had clarified a number of matters about the EBA, clarified some of the misinformation in the debate, and had given the CFA many assurances about the agreement. Can I say I don't take much comfort from those assurances, and I know volunteers don't take much comfort from those assurances. And the truth is that we know why the EBA was finally signed. It was signed because the entire board of the CFA was sacked. A new board was appointed with the express instruction that they should resolve this agreement by signing it without much further delay, and a new CEO was appointed to do that. I just want to make some observations about the actual bill before us today, because I think that is relevant, and I was very heartened to hear Senator Cameron outline his concerns about the red tape implications of this bill, about the federalism implications of this bill, about the small government implications of this bill. There is hope for Senator Cameron yet if he, late in his career, is showing such an interest in such high principles. But unfortunately, in this instance, he is not right and his concerns are erroneous. The only thing that this bill does to address the direct problem that we have seen in this EBA is to add the definition of objectionable terms in Section 12 of the Fair Work Act. It will prohibit objectionable emergency and management terms. They are defined. They are terms which would prevent emergency services bodies from being able to properly manage their volunteer operations, the terms which are contrary to the relevant state legislation covering these bodies. The Fair Work Commission will no longer be able to approve agreements that contain these terms, and any such terms in existing agreements will be legally ineffective. This will mean that an enterprise agreement can no longer undermine the capacity of emergency services volunteer bodies to properly manage their operations. Now, contrary to the concerns raised by some in the hearing and in the chamber today, this will only apply to firefighting and state emergency service organisations in Victoria, the ACT and the Northern Territory, because they are covered by the National Workplace Relations System. The bill will also give volunteer organisations the right to make submissions to the Fair Work Commission about enterprise agreements covering certain emergency services bodies that could affect the volunteers they represent. I think that is a very welcome amendment, given that we know that the interests of volunteers have been so overlooked in this debate and in this EBA negotiations. I want to conclude my remarks by recommending to the Senate that it pass this bill with the utmost urgency, so that our volunteers and paid firefighters in the CFA can begin to prepare and begin to focus on their priority, which is protecting our community ahead of the summer and ahead of the fire season, which is coming up.